So here in our text, we have three separate thoughts that we read through. You've got the disciples arguing about who's going to be the greatest. You've got Peter, AKA Simon, Jesus telling him that he's going to deny him. And then you've got the whole knapsack and money bag situation. And in of its own self, those three situations could have been a sermon on their own in a vacuum. There's plenty of application that we could pull out from each of those, and we will pull out application from each of those. But when I was reading this and studying this, what I actually felt was there's an emotional tone beneath the application of this passage that I think actually is going to bring some light, to shed some light onto what's happening here for the disciples and for you and I. And so we're going to look at these three different scenarios, these three different moments within the Passover meal scene and see what's happening there. But then we're going to tie it all together at the end. But to get there, though, we need to start at what we see is Jesus's hope for this evening. Because Jesus has been journeying to Jerusalem all throughout the Gospel of Luke. He's been with his disciples doing miracles, teaching, healing people, feeding the 5,000. Then he gets to Jerusalem and he comes in on the donkey in his triumphal entry, and he tells his disciples to go and prepare the Passover meal for them. And they meet here in the upper room for this Passover meal. And Jesus says earlier in this chapter, in verse 15, he said to the disciples, I have earnestly desired to eat the Passover meal with you before I suffer. Now, I don't know how many times I've read through the Passover meal passage, but I just had never noticed Jesus' language there. Do you catch what Jesus is saying? Do you see the language? I've earnestly desired to eat this meal with you. The CSB will translate it to, I have fervent to eat this Passover meal with you. In the Message, I love how Eugene Peterson translates it. He says, Jesus says, you have no idea how much I have looked forward to eating this Passover meal with you before I enter into my time of suffering. Can you feel this anticipation and hope and longing that Jesus is setting the stage with for this Passover meal? He's been looking forward to eating this meal with his closest friends. But then if you fast forward to the end of this passage, in response to his disciples saying that they have two swords, Jesus says, oh yeah, that's enough. Which is, to be honest with you, a little bit of a confusing statement that Jesus would say, yeah, two swords is enough. So what I want to do is I want to ask the question, how do we get from point A, where Jesus is saying, I've earnestly desired to eat this meal with you, to point B, Jesus saying, yeah, two swords is enough, as we are about to go be confronted by the Romans. So to do that, to ask that question, we're going to have to recap a little bit of what's happened in chapter 22 at this Passover meal, and then we're going to work our way to the end, and then I think that we're going to tie it all together. So in chapter 22, we see the famous Last Supper, the Passover meal that we talked about last week a little bit, that Jim introduced last week, where Jesus is having this meal with his disciples. And when I think of the Passover meal, what I want to do is I want to try to help you guys feel it. I want to help you guys put yourself into the Passover meal. And so whenever I was thinking about this, to me, it just kind of felt like this iconic moment in history that resembled a little bit of like a Chef's Table moment. Anybody watch Chef's Table on Netflix? Ooh, we got a couple of woos. People like food. I like food. It's that moment where time just kind of starts to slow down a little bit. And all of a sudden, if you were sitting at this Passover meal, you would have been sitting there and you'd been like at the table and you'd been like, oh my goodness, the wood grain on this table is stunning. The colors in this room are so beautiful. It was this moment where everything time just kind of stood still for a moment. And you're like, are those fireflies surrounding us? This is is that a string quartet playing in the background, Jesus? And then Jesus would have taken the bread and he would have broke it. And he would have handed it to you and you'd be like, this is the most amazing, beautiful bread I've ever seen in my life. Jesus, did you bake? Did you bake this? And then he would have taken the cup, took a sip of it, handed it to you. You would have taken a sip yourself and your taste buds would have exploded. You'd be like, oh my goodness, Jesus, tell me you didn't save some of the wine from the wedding feast of Cana for tonight because this stuff's incredible. And everything would have been just right. It was this iconic moment. And then Jesus would have said, hey, there's going to be somebody here who's going to betray me. And you're like, oh, that's a little awkward. And all of a sudden, rumblings start happening in the room. All of a sudden, there begins to be a dispute that rises with the disciples. Because the text says that the disciples begin to argue about who was going to be the greatest. And listen, I'm just imagining here, but I like to think that Peter, in that moment where the rumblings are going on, Peter just kind of leans over, because Peter's a little bit of a knucklehead. If you read the Gospels, Peter's just doesn't really know when not to say something. And so I just imagine that Peter kind of leans over and whispers to John, because John's all up in Jesus. He's like, hey, man, I'm the disciple that you love. And so John's just sitting there looking at Jesus, and Peter leans over to him and goes, yo, bro, it ain't gonna be me who's gonna deny him. It ain't gonna be me who's gonna betray him. I'm the GOAT. And I just feel like Peter just begins to antagonize John like all Muhammad Ali, like, I am the greatest. And meanwhile, Jesus is like, really, dude? Really? Because we know that a dispute arose among the disciples, and sitting here, and he's gotta be thinking, cool. I just told you that I'm gonna be betrayed, but yeah, no big deal, disciples. Let's talk about you for a moment. But you see, guys, the topic of greatness was one that had plagued the disciples throughout their ministry. And so Jesus, recognizing the moment, says, hey, cool, we'll stop down and we will actually address this, because I know that this is something that has come up before. So he says in verse 25, if you wanna look with me in verse 25, Jesus says, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them who are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the one who serves, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, the one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. When the disciples are arguing over who is going to be greater in the kingdom of God, Jesus flips this concept on his head about what it means to have true greatness, what true greatness actually looks like. And he says it looks a lot like servant leadership. The disciples are not to lead as the world does through the exercise of power. Now, it's important that we note that Jesus doesn't say that there are to be no leaders, but rather that leaders are to serve. And if Jesus is great, and I think that we would all acknowledge that he is, and he does not live like the world, how should his followers live? Well, the call is clear. It's to lead by serving. And so we've got this moment where Jesus stops down and he says, all right, disciples, let me engage this with you one more time. Let me help you see this one more time, that I am Jesus, and even I don't lead by exercising power, but I lead by serving. And that's how we are to be leading. And at this point, I think maybe Jesus, having stopped down, probably would have been like, just a little bit frustrated, because again, remember, he's got this longing and hope and anticipation for this evening, and now his disciples are arguing and grumbling. He's like, all right, cool, I'll stop down and I'll address this with you. And then he looks to Peter. He zooms in on Peter and he says, Simon, Simon. Now, what's interesting here is that if you know the backstory of Peter, you know that Peter's not his given name. Simon is actually Peter's given name. That's his real name. But early in Jesus' ministry, he gives Simon the nickname Peter that he's exclusively referred to throughout the Gospels after that point, because Jesus knows who Simon is going to be. He knows who Peter is going to be. He knows that after it's all said and done, he's going to look at him on the beach eating breakfast and say, upon this rock, I will build my church. And so he gives Simon the nickname Peter, which in the Greek is the word Petra, which is our word, where we get our word for rock. Jesus gives Simon the nickname Rocky because he knows who he's going to be. And yet it's intentional here that Jesus then reverts back to Simon, Simon. Behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Jesus knows that Peter is about to deny him. But get this, his solution, his words of comfort to Peter facing the absolute darkest moment of his life is, I have prayed for you. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I were going into a dark moment and Jesus was like, hey man, don't worry, I prayed for you. I think I'd probably be like, cool, but you're Jesus. Couldn't you just like keep it from happening? Like, couldn't you just go back and do that instead? And yet Jesus is not unaware of what is coming for Peter. He's not oblivious to the moment he's about to step into. And with the wisdom, good Father, he prays that Peter's faith may not fail. Look at what he prays for, that Peter's faith may not fail. Not that the hard thing wouldn't happen, not that he would be free from suffering, not that he would have comfort and his life would be easy, but that his faith would not fail. Beloved, look at the heart of Jesus on display here. He doesn't shield us from every storm, but with the wisdom, he prays that we will be able to endure the storm. Knowing that the testing of our faith will produce steadfastness, just like James says in chapter 1, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. It's easy for us, right? It's easy for us to want God to take away our trial, to take away our pain, to take away our suffering. And yet, more times than not, God will use our suffering, use our trial to draw us into deeper intimacy with him. Will he not? That's what we see here with Peter. Jesus prays for him that his faith wouldn't fail. And in the coming chapters, even when it seemed like Peter's faith had burned to the ground, when it looked like the night was darkest, there was an ember of faith still burning beneath the ash. The ember of Jesus' prayer for Peter that kept him from falling away. Now, it would be silly for me to think that in a crowd this size, there aren't more than a few of you who are walking through some hard moments in your life. And if that is you right now, I want you to hear this. That in the same way that Jesus held Peter, even from the tomb, Jesus holds you now. You may not feel it, or it might just feel hard to believe, but it's not the strength of your faith that matters. It is, in fact, the object of your faith that matters. And it's Jesus who holds you. So we get to rest in that hope. We get to cling to that hope. And so my prayer for you is that you would cling to that hope that Jesus holds you. Unfortunately, Peter still hadn't learned how to cling to that. And we know that because of how he responds to Jesus. Look at verse 33. Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus says, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. See, Jesus puts his heart on full display for Peter, but Peter misses it. Peter still thinks it's about his strength that Jesus is talking about here. Peter had such a narrow view of how he thought that things should go that he misses what Jesus is trying to tell him. Peter had such a narrow view of what he thought that life should look like that he misses Jesus' prayer for him, that his faith wouldn't fail. And so after his disciples are arguing about who's going to be the greatest, after Peter misses him, Jesus turns back to his disciples and he says in verse 35, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, nothing. And he said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And Jesus said to them, it is enough. This is the point when I was reading through this initially where I was like, huh? Like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Like, why would you say it's enough to this? This doesn't make any sense. But having studied it, I began to realize that this is actually the point of the passage that unlocked the rest of this Passover meal discourse for me. And so I want to show you what's going on here. First, Jesus is referencing the journey he sent the disciples on back in Luke 10. In Luke 10, he sent them out and he asked them the question, when I sent you out, did you lack anything? And they said, well, nothing, of course. But Jesus says, now let the one who has a money bag take it, and a knapsack take it, and sell your cloak to buy a sword. So he says, when I sent you out, you didn't lack anything, but now I'm going to send you out, and it's going to be different. It's contrasting their first journey with how people received them. He draws his disciples' attention to the fact that they were sent out with nothing and yet lacked nothing because the people who received them took care of their needs. Then he pivots and says, but now you will not be accepted. Because of me and what I'm about to walk into, people are not going to welcome you with open arms. No, they're probably going to hate you. So instead of going out with nothing, be prepared for it to be a struggle. You see, the sword that Jesus is referencing here isn't a literal sword. He's trying to show his disciples that conflict awaits them. And we know that because when you look at Jesus' teachings as a whole, we know that he doesn't want his disciples going around with swords fighting people. No, a perfect example of this is just 15 verses later in this passage where one of his disciples lops off a dude's ear in the garden and Jesus says, stop it, and then puts his ear back on. Right? We know that Jesus isn't saying, yeah, I want you to go fight people with swords. But rather he's saying, no, guys, conflict awaits you. This is a metaphorical sword that he's talking about here. He's trying to show them that the prophecies of old are about to be fulfilled in him. And because of this, just how the prophets were hated, Jesus and his followers will be too. He's trying to prepare them that they had better be ready. And to be honest, doesn't this feel a little bit like our culture today? Doesn't this feel a little bit like our moment that we live in today where people aren't all that jazzed up to talk to us about Jesus? People are a little bit obstinate to talk to us about Jesus. And despite knowing that things are going to be hard, Jesus still sent his disciples out. And he still sends us out. Knowing that it was going to be hard, he makes no provision for the journey being difficult, saying, oh, if they don't receive you, then don't worry about it. No big deal. Just stay at home. He says, no, it's going to be hard, and yet he's still sending them out on mission. But he's saying that we should be prepared as we go. This is why I love the fact, Jesus says that we should be prepared as we go. I love the fact that the Paradox has things like our outreach classes that we do. I don't know if you guys have heard about our outreach class, but we've been doing an outreach class each month this summer in May, June, and we'll have another one this month in July that you can sign up for on our events site. But the idea there is to help prepare you as you go, taking the cues from Jesus that we should be prepared as we go out, that we are sent people, that we are sent to our friends, families, and neighbors, that we should be prepared. We as a church want to come alongside of that same hope that Jesus has to prepare you and give you an opportunity to feel prepared as you go out. So if you haven't been to that outreach class, I know some of you here have been, but if you haven't, I would encourage you to look into it and see if you can sign up, because I want you, like Jesus wants you, to be prepared to go. Amen? Jesus, in the face of the cross, wants his disciples to be prepared to go out even when it's hard. But once again, the disciples miss it. They say, hey, we've got some swords. It reminds me of my 3-year-old son, Henry. Anytime I mention sword, he's like, sword? I'll go get a sword. And he'll bring it back. I feel like the disciples are just like that too. They're like, oh, a sword, Jesus, you want a sword? I got a sword here. And I think that it just helps you see the mindset and mentality that the disciples are in, where they're like, sword? I can get a sword. Here's a sword. Let's go. We got swords. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm not preparing you for battle. I'm trying to teach you something here. And so Jesus responds with, it is enough. Why? Why does he say it is enough? Is he agreeing with them that, yeah, 2 swords is enough? I don't think so. In fact, when you look at the language used that translates "it is enough," the language is actually not in agreement. It's an emphatic enough. It could be translated enough of this. Jesus isn't like, yeah, cool, 2 swords, that's enough. He's saying, enough, guys. I've been longing to have this meal with you. I've been wanting to share this Passover with you, and you missed it and argued about who's the greatest. Peter, you missed it when I said I prayed for you. And guys, I'm trying to prepare you to go out, and you've missed it again. Enough. They miss Jesus at every turn. But how could they do it? How could they have missed Jesus when they were sitting face to face with him? How could they have missed Jesus after walking with him for so long, after seeing miracle after miracle, after seeing healing, after coming to Sunday service after Sunday service, after going to city group, after serving faithfully after Sunday faithfully? How could they have missed Jesus? Well, I think the answer is the same for us and how we can miss Jesus at times. It's that idolatry blinds us. Idolatry being the things that take our heart's attention away from Jesus actually blind us to Jesus. See, I think what's going on here is that the disciples' hearts are being exposed. The disciples, like many of us, love to follow Jesus, but they have their other stuff that they want too. And listen, this is why I love the disciples. They're a raw, honest view of what following Jesus looks like. These guys have been sitting at the same table with Jesus, having the iconic Passover meal, and a few of the boys are arguing. The disciples' hearts are on display that, yes, they want to follow Jesus, but they also want to be the greatest too. I like to call this a side idol. It's like a side hustle, but for your heart. The disciples had their side idol, being the greatest. But don't we do this too? I think we often confuse idolatry as a total renunciation of God. But in reality, how often do we have a side idol that simply takes our heart's affection, attention, and time away from God? We usually don't full on replace God with an idol, but we just add one to him. We don't allow something to necessarily take the full-on throne of God, but we just try to say, yeah, but I got this thing too that I'm going to carry with me. In the Old Testament, it's interesting that the repeated refrain of idolatry throughout Israel's history is not that she stopped worshiping God entirely, but rather that she stopped worshiping God alone. Do you hear that? Your idolatry isn't necessarily that you stop worshiping God entirely and reject him, but it's that you stop worshiping God alone. I think this is what's happening with the disciples in this scene. And this is the danger of our side idols, and that when we allow for something else to steal our heart's affection and attention, we miss Jesus. Jen Wilkin, in her book, 10 Words to Live By, says it perfectly. She says, the children of Yahweh today are not so different from the children of Yahweh then. Like Israel, we affirm that there are no other gods verbally and intellectually, but not practically. Practically, we live as polytheists. Our idolatry is a both and arrangement. I need God and I need a spouse. I need God and I need a smaller waist size. Amen. I need God and I need good health. I need God and I need a well-padded bank account. In our minds, we rationalize that the both ands still offer God some form or degree of worship, so everything must be okay. Yet, according to Genesis and Exodus, to cease to worship God alone is to corrupt any worship still offered to him. This is the danger of our side idols, the things that we allow our hearts to be entertained by, instead of giving our full, undevoted worship to God alone. And listen, guys, the disciples do this, and they've been walking with Jesus in the flesh. We can do this too. I do this. The call here isn't that, how dare you do this, but rather acknowledge that you do this. and ask yourself, what are the things that I do? Because it's the things that we seek to add to Jesus that lead Jesus to say, enough. Here, we see on full display the side idols that the disciples argue over in this passage. They had Jesus, but they wanted him in power. And because of this, they missed him. And if the disciples can miss Jesus, even at the Last Supper, I think we can too. So ask yourself, what are your both aims? What does your heart long for that ultimately ends up being Jesus and something else? Listen, Jesus is very clear in Matthew 6:24. He says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. Jesus is telling us that you cannot do this. It is a zero-sum game, and God isn't just after most of you, he's after all of you. Remember how Jesus longed for this meal with his friends. Just as he prepared a meal for his friends then, he's prepared a meal for you and I, his friends, today. And the call is, don't miss him. Don't miss who Jesus is for what he can do for you. Today, we get a chance to check our hearts, to ask the question, have we missed Jesus? Is there something that we've added to him that we really want? Is there something that is taking your eye or attention away from Jesus? And the good news is that for those of us that would answer yes to that question, which is probably all, his mercies are new for you today. His grace overflows for you today. The fact that you're sitting here hearing this, the fact that the Holy Spirit is putting something on your heart that's telling you that you've allowed this thing to take your attention away from Jesus is a grace from Jesus that is calling you back to worshiping him alone. Church, it is the fierce love of Jesus that is saying it's not okay to allow for you to just continue to run after the things that your heart wants, but it is the fierce love of Jesus that calls us back to worshiping him and him only. We simply need to have times in our life, rhythms in our time and walk with Jesus where we ask the question, what are those things, so that we can turn back to him? And so I want to give you a chance to do that today. I want you to acknowledge what that thing is. Confess how it's been taking your heart's affection and attention away from Jesus. Confess what you've been wanting to get from that. And then let the Lord show you how he can perfectly, and how he does perfectly, fulfill that desire. And then when he does that, you actually get to turn back to him in worship, because you see, he's not mad at you. He's not shaming or guilting you back into worship of him, but he's a loving Father who's calling you back into right relationship with him. Don't miss Jesus today. Follow him alone. Worship him alone.